without the West even actually trying, Ukraine has stopped Russia. 11 years, Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine, over 800,000 casualties. So I don't know why there's such a rush to hurry up and get a negotiation done when in fact Russia is in big trouble here.
There are some slightly less well understood questions about conversations Donald Trump has been having, this time with Vladimir Putin. He told the New York Post that he'd better not say how many times he'd spoken to the Russian leader, but he believes that Putin does care about the killing on the Ukrainian battlefield. The Kremlin, though, refuses to confirm or deny Trump's statement, and the White House hasn't commented since Mr. Trump spoke to the Post. So we can talk to retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of the US Army Europe. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, guys.
Just on those conversations first between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, how many times do we think they may have spoken?
It's impossible, for any of us to know. I'm sure it's a lot more than what we think. And of course, that's part of the problem, is this lack of transparency.
And is he authorised, Donald Trump, to discuss a deal with President Putin? I mean, he's obviously the president. He can phone whoever he wants and they may or may not pick up. But does he have authorization to agree a deal?
Well, I think that the Ukrainians would not agree with that. And probably most European countries would also say that the idea of the American president and the president of the Russian Federation deciding what was going to happen in Ukraine over the heads of everyone else, as if this was the 18th century, is not appropriate. So nobody gives authorization, but certainly the president can talk to who he would want to discuss things with.
Do you think that we will ever get a record of these conversations? I mean, in the UK, if the Prime Minister has a conversation with a world leader, journalists would be given something called a readout, which would explain in general terms what the conversation was about. Are we likely to see any record of these chats?
Well, and certainly in normal times in the United States, that's also what would have happened. There would have been people in there recording what was agreed. But during Trump 1, when he kept anybody out of his conversation with President Putin in Helsinki, you'll remember, and your listeners will remember, that was cause for real concern, and it feeds the narrative or the lack of confidence, the concern that many people have about what sort of agreement and relationship he does have with Putin. It could be totally legit, but the fact that there is no transparency, there is no readout, and this is being done in a way that doesn't really indicate that he sees Putin as the bad guy here, as the invader, I think is a reason for real concern.
And also, clearly, Donald Trump knew that he wasn't supposed to talk about these conversations because he said, I'd better not say how many times he'd spoken to the Russian leader.
Well, again, there's not a restriction on how often he might speak with another leader, just like how much he might speak with your prime minister. So this kind of, you have to be, what the president says often is not what typically a president would say or how they would say it. And so that when I read that myself, that I better not say, that wasn't like, oh, I might be violating something. He knows that people are suspicious of his relationship with Putin. I think people are more concerned that, he never criticizes the Russians for their aggression. He only has, he and his envoy, General Kellogg, talk about, Ukraine will have to cede something. We have to think about Ukraine not joining NATO. They may have to have an election. These are all Kremlin talking points. And so however many times he talks to Putin is not relevant. What matters is he's trying to achieve some sort of a end to the fighting, as he and Secretary Rubio say, when in fact that may not be the best thing for Ukrainians or for the West. So my biggest concern is we don't know what the hell his strategic objective is. Stopping the fighting is not an end state. That actually would be a gift to the Kremlin.
Yeah, and it makes it even more strange that he went on to say, President Trump, he believes that Putin does care about the killing on the Ukrainian battlefield. Just in terms of where we are now with the Ukraine conflict with Russia, I mean, what do you foresee in the next couple of months? Because a lot of people have been pushing for an April deadline, for something to have happened by April, some kind of agreement, some kind of end to the fighting, essentially. Is that still possible, do you believe?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that not a single person on the planet actually believes that Putin is concerned about Russian soldiers or wants to stop the killing. If he was, then they would leave immediately. I mean, this whole thing started with his invasion of Ukraine 11 years ago. So that's an important fact in this whole situation. I don't understand artificial timelines like this has to be done by April because of what? I mean, the we have made so many mistakes over our history by putting artificial timelines for certain things rather than focusing on the strategic objective. What is it? What do we want this area to look like when this is all said and done? What is at stake? And of course, the Chinese are watching very closely. Does the West, does the United States have the political will to stop Russia from violation of sovereignty, disregarding international law, disrupting freedom of navigation, all the things that China also is threatening? And they're seeing that it looks like the United States and our allies don't really have the political will to do that.
And is that your reflection, having seen the conversations across Europe about a potential peacekeeping force on the border? Because there is some hesitancy from countries like Germany about doing that.
Well, once again, talk about a peacekeeping force without identifying what the end state is. I mean, when I hear about a peacekeeping force, I put myself in the shoes of who will be responsible for this, and I would be asking, so what is my mission? What am I supposed to do? This cannot be 10,000 people with blue helmets on. I mean, this will have to be a force that deters Russia from violation. General Kellogg, the envoy, was correct early on when he said Russia cannot be trusted. Of course they cannot be trusted. And so just like they violated the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements and ceasefires immediately, they will test this one unless we put in there a force that is going to deter Russia from doing this. I have to say that I think the Ukrainians are not going to accept some sort of outcome where they're not involved in the negotiations, where they are the only ones making any kind of concessions, and where NATO membership or some sort of real security guarantee is not included. And I think the Russians, they see all this, and there's the only incentive for Russia to make an agreement that's good for all of us will be if Ukraine is allowed to keep punishing them, and if we use the economic sanctions, the potential that we have to put pressure on them. I mean, without the West even actually trying, Ukraine has stopped Russia. 11 years, Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine, over 800,000 casualties. So I don't know why there's such a rush to hurry up and get a negotiation done when in fact Russia is in big trouble here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, thank you for joining us on the programme this morning.
Thanks for the privilege.
That was so interesting. I'm so struck, though, by that the run-up to that conversation, Kate, was all the things Trump said. Mm-hmm. And the lesson he must be taking, though, from everything he says stuff about Canada, everyone sort of goes, OK, fair enough. He says crazy stuff about Gaza, everyone goes, OK, fair enough. I wonder if in his mind he's thinking, can he really do a deal between Ukraine and Russia, even though he's not really a party to the conflict? Because everything so far he said, people have taken him really seriously, irrespective of how logical it sounds. I just don't know what's the lesson for him in all of this.
Well, I suppose the question is a bigger one about what, as Ben Hodges was saying there, like what is his end game? What is the point of Donald Trump speaking to President Putin? What does that conversation hold for both of those men? And that's the big unknown here. And I think it's important for us to know, because in this country and in America, normally, you would be able to understand what those conversations were about. And not knowing is it's a line crossed, I think.
It's also, we've spent so much money on Ukraine and so much effort and so much emotion and so much everything in the last 4 years to sort of say, oh, we'll probably just let it just end in this way feels odd as well, doesn't it? We've invested, I mean, how much political capital has been invested in Ukraine? I mean, you saw it with Johnson, you saw it with Ben Wallace, you've seen it with Keir Starmer, you saw it with Rishi Sunak. An awful lot has been invested on this side for us to suddenly say, well, if Trump thinks it's okay for him to settle like this, then we'll just go along with it.
But settle doesn't mean ending that contribution, because the point, I think, is without some kind of security guarantee from European nations, including the UK, there is no way that this could ever be workable, and Ukraine wouldn't accept it. And that's the big question for governments here, I think, and abroad.